Blog Talk Radio.
Welcome to Revelations with Erin Pizzey. On this show, we will be exploring the issues faced by men and boys everywhere. We will be sharing our perspectives and your own. Your host, Erin Pizzey, was born in 1939 in China while her father was stationed there as a member of the British Foreign Office. In 1971, Erin opened the first ever domestic violence refuge for battered women and children in Chiswick, England. What she found, however, was that many of the women coming into her shelter were as violent as the men they were fleeing. Over the years, she also tried to create resources and safe spaces for men as well as women, but frequently met with indifference and hostility to men suffering. Nevertheless, it's a passion she continues to hold to this day for men, for women, and especially for children.
For so many years, feminists have been able to demonize men under their artificial argument called patriarchy. Hi, I'm Erin Pizzey, and through working with battered women in my refuges, I saw for myself how family violence is passed on from one generation to the next. Quite simply, violent behavior experienced in childhood is often carried forward into adult relationships. Family violence is not a gender issue, and never was. It's a generational issue. To my amazement, nobody ever wanted to hear why violent people treat each other the way they do. Instead, feminists have had people believe that men are responsible for all the violence in our society. There is sufficient evidence that both men and women can be equally violent in their personal relationships, but for many years, men and boys have been held to ransom and have been made to live in the knowledge that they are dispensable and shamed. There is an enormous job ahead of us, but my hope is that the 21st century will see men and women standing shoulder to shoulder and working together to actively take on the feminists and to show everyone that domestic violence is not and never has been a gender issue.
The truth is that men and boys are not privileged in our society, but are often marginalised, disadvantaged and ignored. We will be inviting you to call in and discuss your views and your experiences. Anyone of any age, sex, sexual orientation or religious background is invited to call in and talk. We may not get to everyone, but we will do our best within the show's allotted time. If you do wish to call in to share your own experiences, you will probably want to keep things on a first-name basis. You may wish to use a pseudonym for yourself or family members so that there's no concern about privacy. Welcome to Revelations with Erin Pizzey and her co-host, Dean Esme. The truth is often painful to hear, but in truth there is hope, and we hope you will stick around to hear it. Hello and welcome. I'm Andy Thomas from A Voice for Men UK, and today I'll be filling in for Dean Esme, your regular host who can't be with us on this show due to ill health. We hope that Dean will be feeling better soon, and no doubt he'll be back with us for the next show. Erin is with me and she'll be co-hosting this show. Say hello, Erin.
Hello, everybody.
Today we'll be examining the attitudes and experiences of young men and teenage boys, and discussing how they differ from previous generations. We will be taking calls, so if you have any views or questions, we encourage you to call in and share them. We don't want to restrict discussion to any single country or culture, so please do feel free to call in wherever you are. We'd especially like to hear any perspectives from younger guys. Our guest today is Geoffrey James, who is known to many of our listeners as Solaris. Geoffrey runs a Nice Guy forum, and he's a well-known member of the MGTOW community. He's also a vocational trainer who works with us in the Australian educational system, primarily teaching teenage boys and young men. Geoffrey, why don't you go ahead and say hello and tell us a little bit about yourself and the nature of your work?
Oh, hi, Andy. Hi, Erin. Well,
Hello.
look, I've been teaching pretty much all of my adult life. I started teaching when I was 17. I started teaching violin to younger children, for the most part. Some teenagers, but mostly younger children. Then after I eventually left that, I moved into the tertiary education system, teaching technology-related subjects to mostly, but almost all class members were boys, from ages about 14, 15 at the youngest up to about 21, for the most part.
Okay, I'm very interested in how the attitudes of young men and teenage boys differ from previous generations. And when I was a teenager, I very much felt that relationship was an important goal in life. I don't think I was aware of it consciously, but I saw that having a girlfriend was a way to validate myself as a man and a human being. Geoffrey, is this something that teenage boys and young men that you deal with relate to?
Not really. Most of them, or most of the boys in the class did not have girlfriends. There would probably be no more than 10%. And as far as I could tell, most of them were not actively pursuing girlfriends. It wasn't something that was on the radar for them. They seemed to feel. Yes, go ahead.
Sorry, Jeff, I just needed. Can you tell us what age group we're talking about?
We're talking boys sort of 15, 16 up to about young men up to about the age of 21 for the most part.
Well, what was it about them that just, because I work in schools and even my 10-year-old boys are busy finding themselves girlfriends. I was understood that teenagers, boys and girls, and I've got a granddaughter, are still quite romantically interested in each other. Has there been a change?
From my perspective, there has been, in the sense that they don't really see themselves as boyfriend material, perhaps, would be the best way of explaining it. They don't seem to feel that there's any reason to pursue any particular girl because they probably won't be successful. You know, they certainly don't have the confidence to approach women. They don't really, I mean, it's not that they wouldn't like to have girlfriends, I'm sure, but even the ones that had girlfriends did not seem particularly interested in talking about them, or, you know, there was sort of like, well, there's this girl that I see and she's my girlfriend, and that was about the end of it.
Really, that's a very big change, I think, because, sorry, you go ahead.
Do you think there's a possible difference between Australia and the UK?
Oh, look, there's always going to be differences, but look, in Australia at least, things have changed very rapidly in a very short period of time, because Australian culture was sort of coming into its own in the 1980s, but in many respects it was a lot more like 1960s American culture. You know, families were intact. You know, it was much more, or much less ethnically diverse by comparison. You know, it was a very strong and growing culture. And then it was just sort of swamped by, from my perspective, swamped by the introduction of global culture when the internet took off, when the World Wide Web took off. So the change that has happened in such a short period of time, perhaps by comparison.
I must say, I do think in a way that's very true, because an awful lot of young men that I know hardly ever are off their computers or their PlayStations. And gaming, as far as I'm concerned, my grandson can game for 3 days on end and be oblivious to everything.
Well, that's because they're allowed to succeed there. You're allowed to be judged on your merits. If you're good at something, you'll still be judged on your merits, which is not the kind of thing that happens for them in the school system when they come to me, or in the education system when they come to me. You know, they're not really expecting to be judged on their merits. They're expecting to show up and pass, for one, and they're expecting to just, you know, they're just there because they're supposed to be there. You know, what else do you do?
So what do the girls do? Because quite a lot of them must be deprived of boyfriends.
Well, here's the problem, is that you've probably got 90% of the girls chasing about 10% of the guys.
And the other 90% of the guys have turned their backs then?
Not turn their backs, but they just don't see themselves as having a realistic chance.
That's
so, I mean... Well, it is, but in one respect, I'm not suggesting this is a good thing, but they have internet pornography, which isn't something which I had, was a little bit too... came a bit after my schooling, and they have their internet pornography, so if they really want to look at attractive women, they know where they can go.
And that's even more of a tragedy, because that has nothing to do with relationships. And
no, it doesn't.
And for boys who are just emerging and learning about sex, it's really sad, because a lot of that pornography is very harmful, because it's extreme, and a lot of it's pain. And it's well...
I'm not in a position to comment on that, other than to say that it's certainly different from when I was growing up. Being at school, seeing a girl wearing a knee-length dress was exciting, and I've had people say to me, especially people from the US, say to me, where are you from? Are you from some kind of third world country? Well, no, it's just that Australia was always a lot more conservative in that respect. That's why I say things changed very, very quickly here. So, when I was at school, in high school, a girl wearing a knee-length dress was interesting.
Yeah,
Sorry, Erin, go ahead.
No, what I was going to say is that essentially what's happened with relationships is that all the romantic side of it and the tender side of it has been taken out, and you have boys who are so ashamed of themselves they don't think they're worthy of a relationship with a girlfriend, and that's tragic. And then you have very puzzled girls who don't understand why all this is happening. Let's go back to the beginning. Can I ask you, Geoffrey, when were you first, now ask Andy for his experience as well, when were you first aware that as far as you as a boy was concerned, there was almost institutionalized misogyny against you? See, this is what I'm seeing in schools. Boys are simply not liked.
Well, I'm probably not quite the norm there, because I had a teacher in 4th grade when I was 9 years old, and she would find every excuse to punish the boys in the class, quite literally.
You're in the majority, not the minority.
Oh, well, fair enough then. Well, look, I mean, she was quite blatant about it, and she, as I understand it, she was reprimanded several times, but because she was a permanent employee, there wasn't much that the school system could do. It wasn't as if she was at risk of losing her job. See, I was lucky enough to have good male teachers in my primary school years and in my high school years, so I probably didn't get it anywhere near as badly as some others. Certainly towards the end of my high schooling, a women's studies professor was called in from the local university to lecture all of us, as I attended a boys-only school, and she fed us she said to us that 1 in 3 girls would be sexually abused by the time they were 18, and of course all of us were aghast, and the implication was that we were all responsible for
That's
either
the damage is done.
For either participating in it or for, not doing anything to stop it. And, we all obviously came out of that particular lecture feeling like rubbish.
Isn't it strange, though, because the other alternative was for all of you to say to yourselves, that was rubbish, not I'm rubbish. But men seem, to me, can I ask you if this is true, to actually eat in a way that women actually refuse to do. But men seem to, any kind of criticism, and a man will own up to it.
This is, I think, partially true because we're taught to take responsibility for ourselves and for our actions and for the actions of those around us. And as well as that, being in the educational system, you tend to accept information uncritically at that point.
Yeah.
Especially in primary school and early, even late secondary school, depending on your school environment, you tend to accept information uncritically. So we had no reason to question what we were being told. You know, we were all shocked and aghast, but I don't think anybody said, oh, this is nonsense.
Andy, how about you? Because you're here in England.
That's true, but I'm also perhaps 10 years older than Geoffrey.
Yeah.
I'm looking back at my childhood and education, and on the whole, it was pretty good. But when I think back to primary school, there was a good mix of male teachers. I can remember 3 or 4 male teachers at primary school, and I can remember many male teachers at secondary school. I know for a fact now, because I've looked this up, I've looked on the internet at my old primary school, and there's not a single male member of staff today at that school.
I think that's true of everywhere.
Yeah. Also, I was very fortunate in secondary school in that I had some very good male teachers, and 2 in particular who actually spent a lot of time with me, and one of them I'm still friends with.
But I'm asking you about when you first began to realise that you are ashamed because of what you have heard or been told.
The realisation occurred much later in life, but the shame came in much earlier. I had no awareness of it. I have a particular experience when I was around 17 years old. And I did read a lot. It wasn't from school, but I did read a lot, and I did watch television a lot, and I got the message that men are responsible for sexually attacking women, and it's men who do this. And I felt very, very much ashamed. In fact, I went so far as to write into a women's magazine, into the agony aunt page, effectively, and to apologise on behalf of all men for the behaviour of other men. And it's one of the experiences that sticks with me, because I felt it was my responsibility somehow, because I was male. And in reality, it's a million miles from who I am and what I am. And it's something, when I look back now, I've become quite angry about, because, you know,
it's no good. I was just going to say, it's no good shaming the people who, you know, who are actually going to feel shame, because they're not the people who you're trying to reach, and you're never going to reach those people who do sexually attack women with shame. I mean, it's ridiculous looking back.
But yes, I know you can say that. But now I'm 74. Now, even at my time, girls were told that there's only one thing that men want, that you have to never give in to them, that they're dangerous, and it's got exceedingly worse with the women's movement, because they used it as a political tool, and shaming men is a political tool. And one of the problems is in school, it says instituted, whatever it is, but essentially boys are made to feel that they are potentially dangerous. And when you're in a room on your own with a boy, and the headmaster comes in and says, you can't be here without another adult, looks meaningfully at me and says, it's for your own protection, in front of the boy,
yeah,
you can see why men don't want to work in schools.
It's terrible. And I think the problem that men have, I guess it would be particularly problematic for young men, is that they are given no framework whatsoever to understand themselves. What they have is just a series of historical conventions about chivalry and about doing things and manning up for women and stepping up. And really, that's the only framework that they have in order to understand their place in the world.
I think that's very true.
So
well, look, through my work, let me say this: through my work, I've seen that starting to fall apart. You know, some young men, not a lot, but some young men have turned up with very bad attitudes towards women. And I don't mean that in the sense that I was, you know, disgusted at their attitude, etc., etc. I mean, they literally had a bad attitude towards women. You know, because these classes were almost always exclusively male, occasionally the topic of women in tech would come up, and there would be one or two in the class who'd say, oh, you know, women shouldn't be in tech, they should just get out. That's starting to fall apart, to be honest. Those, as you say, those historic conventions are starting to fall to pieces, and they probably will continue to do so if things keep going the way they have been.
Well, they are going to keep going the way they have been, because there's no, apart from a voice for men and a few individuals, there are virtually no other outlets to allow men to have voices. And as I keep seeing, any time a man actually stands up and wants to be heard, he's a hate crime. Whereas women can get away with it, eugenically wanting to kill all men, and that's on websites. And
oh, that's perfectly fine, isn't it? I mean, that's
there you go.
Yeah. But in any case, the work, as I said, the work which I've done at the tertiary level, a lot of guys show up not feeling like they really have much potential for a relationship, and on the physical side of things, they can get that itch scratched to a degree. So there's not really a lot of incentive to pursue a relationship from their point of view, especially if a lot of them coming into the part of the system which I was working in were coming from single mother families, and they didn't really want to, seem particularly interested in ending up in the same situation themselves as their fathers might have, or, they perhaps becoming their father, and whether he was kicked out or ran off, whichever it may have been. So there was a combination of apathy and, feelings of shame and the ability to get at least one part of, the physical side of things met in some sense. But
the trouble is, too, I must say that one of the things that bothers me is, as far as boys are concerned, very often it's the mother who's the abuser, and it leaves the boys with a very strong feeling that they will never risk a relationship with any woman. And that's really sad.
Yeah, I think it would be very difficult for boys and young men to understand that their mother is an abuser, because they're given no framework. They're simply told that all violence in society is directed against women and girls.
Yeah.
They have nothing to hook it into. They're lost at sea in their understanding, and they've simply got the narrative and the notions of convention from the past.
And I think also, for instance, in LA, where I am quite a lot, the men's attitude is they don't make any real relationships with women. They just date, which means they can have sex with as many women they want to if they are seeing them. And it's interesting to see the women's reaction to this, because they're absolutely gobsmacked. Because as far as they're concerned, they're still looking for relationships. And also, so many women are on a time frame because they're coming up to where their biological clock is going to shut off, and they're going to be deprived of a loving relationship with a partner and children. At the end of the day, women have got more to lose than men. I don't think women realise that.
I think men have already lost it.
Yeah.
Lost many things, and the issue is that when you've got nothing to lose, there's nothing to lose anymore, and men simply step back. They've got nothing to fight for anymore. There's nothing worthwhile for them.
No, this was... sorry, go ahead.
Do you think depression and mental health is an issue for some of the young boys and young men that you teach?
Yes, but I'm actually going to say here that to a degree, they were trying to support each other. I don't think they could have named the issues, in the same way that we can articulate them, because we see it from the outside. But there was definitely a little bit of mutual support sort of going on, and also Australia tends to have a strong culture of mateship, which perhaps plays a part. So I mean, the situation could have been worse. It's less than ideal because there was no male leadership for a lot of these guys, no ability to find expression for their masculinity, but they did have each other, which was at least one thing in their favour.
I think that's fantastic, because one of the things that's bothered me most here in England is that most men, my generation of men, had no idea how to relate to each other. They related only through their woman that they were married to or living with. And to see and hear of a younger generation of men who can form close, warm relationships with each other is fantastic. More of that needs to happen everywhere.
Yeah.
No, I think that is. I think that is sort of re-emerging, and it is. It's there. It's definitely there. It's a real thing. The guys will get together, and they're quite happy to accept anybody who wants to come along to, whatever their type of get-together is, whether it's drinking or video games or just going out, or, perhaps they drive off in the car out to the middle of nowhere and do some burnouts. It doesn't really matter. The point is, almost all of these sort of groups have never been cliques. It's like, if you want to come along, you ask, and you 99% of the time it's like, yeah, fine, come along.
Good.
I'd actually like to take the conversation back to education and shame that we were discussing a minute ago. I've actually got in front of me an extract which was published on an internet forum in 2012. It was written by a young man using the username of Duran. He had recently graduated from school in the UK, so this is a British perspective. But I'm very keen here to get perspectives from all different cultures and countries. What I'd actually like to do is to read this, and if we've got any listeners who have any questions or comments, they're free to call in. In the US, the number is 310-388-9709. You can also Skype into the show. But what I'll do is I'll read this, and perhaps it's something that we can discuss. So if I start, it starts with, my transition into secondary school is where things changed for the worse. Secondary school is from 11 to 16 years old in England, and I'm not sure what it is in other countries. But immediately it began. We were taught at such a young age of all the atrocities Western men had committed against everyone else. We were literally, and I'm not exaggerating here, taught to be ashamed of ourselves and our gender. Girls, on the other hand, were taught how great the suffragettes were and how without them they'd still be under the tyranny of evil men. I remember a particular class about this in history, where the female teacher and female students were all laughing at the stupidity of boys and men. And I remember the female teacher pointing out that all men had to fight wars, well, women didn't, but it was always the men who started the wars. While the girls all laughed, I remember looking around at all the boys in my class and just sitting there, quietly, with blank stares on their faces, saying nothing. He also adds a little bit later that after all this, I noticed something change within me, and I became apathetic, lazy, and unmotivated. And my grades went from the top 5% in the country at age 11 to pretty much rock bottom. Is that something that you can identify with, Geoffrey?
It is. A lot of the guys who come to me in class don't really see much point in working in a lot of cases. I can't help all of them. You never can save everyone. So when I talk to them, and try to get them interested in learning again, if not for the sake of their futures, then just because it's interesting and fun, then often the experiences they've had are the same previously, which is that, yes, they've found that going through the secondary school system, there was no reason to be doing anything because they were going to be kicked up the backside no matter what they did. So they'd stopped trying. They weren't interested. They were told to sit still and shut up and just do as they were told. And I'm going to quote my old headmaster here, fantastic man. He said, too many educators see boys as a problem to be managed and not young men to be educated.
I think that's brilliant. I think that's absolutely true, certainly of my experience. The thing that I mind is that because boys, essentially, education now is about girls in our country, and the majority of educators simply don't bother with the boys. And in my case, I question why we ever had this these little tables which they all have to sit round, and they're 11-year-old boys in children's chairs. And the girls love the whole idea of a table because they actually work together and they want to please. At the age I'm talking about, boys aren't interested in pleasing. And if they can sit round a table with their back to the teacher, they're just busy messing about. Boys need to sit in desks facing the front because their concentration level is, in most cases, less than the girls. And the reading that they're supposed to do, because I actually help with the reading, the kind of books they're given essentially are all based on what girls like and very little on what boys want to read. Mostly, in my case, about football. Or we go on YouTube. But the fact is that education has failed boys in this country for decades now, and we have a completely uneducated pool of young men who are unemployable and who are on the streets, and basically gangs and drugs are their future.
Yeah, that's exactly...
Sorry.
I'm sorry, Erin, I didn't mean to interrupt, but that's exactly what Duran says here. And he actually has a question for the older generations, and I'll read the final parts of his post, and he says, to any of the older generations out there, I'd just like to tell you this is what it was like to grow up in an education system from 1997 to 2006. My big question is, what is going to happen when my generation has to step up and take their place in the world? From my experience and the facts around me at the time, the majority of boys in my year are either unemployed or doing basic jobs like stacking shelves, digging and other menial jobs. We've literally created a generation of young men who are useless, self-hating, apathetic and lazy. These men don't have father figures in their lives, and even the ones who had father figures like me got shafted hard by the education system we've had to endure.
Well, yeah, that sounds about right, and it sounds, I mean, not in so many words, it's not exactly what I hear, because the guys don't express themselves like that, but that sounds about right.
Yeah, I don't think these guys have the tools to express themselves.
Well, if you'll let me give you a little spiel for a bit, I'd like to tell you what I would do when these guys would come into my class, because I think it's worth understanding, one, how they came in, and two, what I did in class, and three, how they left the class. How things have changed when they left. Okay. So when they would come in, I would say to them, firstly, I am here because I want to be. I mean, I was running a business at the time, so I was teaching about 8 hours a week because I enjoyed it. And it was, with business, your cash flow can be, up or down. And so, yes, there was the money concern, and, the teaching gave me a little bit of extra regular pay that would pay any extra bills that might come in. But, really, as I said to them, I was there because I wanted to be there. I didn't have to be there. So I said to them, I'm a lot younger than some of the other lecturers here who were almost all approaching retirement age, incidentally. And then I said to them, you don't have to call me sir. You can if you want to, but you don't have to. I want you to have the same enthusiasm for what you're here to learn that I have for it. I want you to be able to come here and enjoy yourself. And I want you to pass, and I expect the best, and I will fail you. If you don't do the work, I will fail you, and you will have to repeat. And this sort of, I don't think a lot of them took that statement seriously to start with, but after, for some of them, after failing the first or the second assessment, they'd start to realise, and I would give them constructive feedback, but they would start to realise that it wasn't just a show up and you automatically pass like high school is these days. So they really started to realise that they would have to put in some effort. And that was a challenge to them, and men generally like challenges. Secondly, I found that the guys who were coming in were absolutely gobsmacked that I would give them the freedom to tinker. You know, I would say, I don't care how you solve this. Here's the problem. Here's what you need to solve. You've got some instruction sheets there that you need to fill out, and because this is technology, reading the instructions is important. But fundamentally, if you solve the problem, I'm not worried about how you solved it. And if you have extra time, go and take it apart and put it back together again. I don't mind. And they were they could not believe that they had the freedom in class to do that. You know, it was a huge difference.
I think that's important. And a few minutes ago, I was reminded of an experience I had with an adult man, and he was somebody who's never really been given the opportunity to explore or take responsibility for his own life or to actually fix problems in his own life, and he was very much dependent upon other people to do things for him. And I remember I actually went round to his house for a coffee, and he had, when I knocked on the door, he had a rag hanging out of his letterbox. I thought this was quite strange. So when I got inside, I asked him, why has he got a rag hanging out the letterbox? And he explained that this letterbox was flapping in the wind, and he jammed a rag in there to stop it. And I said to him, well, why don't you fix it? And it haunts me today when I remember the look on his face, because he was wounded by that. Had no response, and it never occurred to him to fix it. And what he said to me is that I've been ringing the council for months and months, but nobody will come out to fix my letterbox. And it's something that stuck with me, because he hadn't had any experience in his life of taking, doing something such as you described. It's almost as if he was just led into dependence. And the commentary that you just made about boys turning up for school, they sit at a desk and not given any opportunity to explore or to do things for themselves, they're expected to be spoon-fed. And I think that could be quite important in later life. What do you think?
Well, absolutely. I mean, it was a huge issue that, and this is another thing which I would say to them. I would say, look, at school you sit around waiting to be told what to do. If and when you get a job, your boss is not going to pay you to sit around and wait to be told what to do. You've got to take the initiative. And I myself learned that the hard way. I mean, my first job is how I learned that, because I would say, but I've done everything you asked me to. I can go and sit out the back now. No. You're supposed to go and find things to do. It never occurred to me. I mean, I know that, I'm sure that makes me sound like an idiot to some of the people who are listening, but it was so far outside my experience in the education system to be expected to take the initiative and go and figure out what needed to be done and to do it. And I sort of harped on that with them relentlessly, and most of them sort of got it by the end. Moreover, when I would talk to them, because we would have usually a 4 or 5 hour block, depending on the subject, with a break in between, and I would usually talk for the first half of the block and say, well, that's quite long, that's 2 hours. But I would always make sure to sort of break every 10 minutes and say, oh, just go and look this up, or go and just do this quickly, or, pick that up and have a look and you can see that what I'm telling you is true. Go and pick up that piece of computer hardware and have a look at the pins, and you can see exactly what I'm talking about. To keep them active, I know I would make sure that I moved around the room and gave them, anything to make the learning process active rather than passive. And if they wanted me to talk about, personal anecdotes of mine, which working in the tech industry for 10 years I have plenty, then I would. If it helped them, or if it helped break up the monotony. For some subjects were very dry. That was the idea. And then during the break, they would go and have, it was usually a 25-minute break, and they would usually go and either, if it was a nighttime class, they would eat dinner, or if it was a daytime class, they would eat lunch. And I would always go with them. And they would say, why are you here? They would always ask me at first, are you going to have lunch with us? I'd say, yep. And we'd talk about other matters. I'd try to give them an inkling at least of an education. So we'd talk about, sometimes video games, but almost always by the end of about week 5, they almost always turned into political discussions as the guys started feeling more comfortable expressing themselves.
Another side, I think, of boys, for boys, is when they have no fathers. I was divorced when my son was 11, and I was incredibly aware from the work I was doing in the refuge, because I could see boys coming into the refuge with their single-parent mothers, and the boys moved like girls. I'd never really thought about it before. But men cross their legs differently to women. And men, when they actually comb their hair, usually put their elbow up, whereas women put their elbow down. And you'd see the boys, because they had basically internalized their mothers. And because they didn't have an alternative, either at home or at school. The refuge always had an equal amount of men working there, particularly to keep it balanced. And sometimes for these boys, that was the first time they met good, gentle men. But my problem is that what does a boy learn in a single-parent family when that all-important moment comes, when he needs to pull away from his female mother and begin to turn out to identify himself as a masculine boy, and then there's nothing there, there's a blank wall. I resolved it by actually fostering 3 or 4 other boys who were all older than Amos. And that, in a sense, gave him his masculine models for him to look at and to grow up with. And my feeling is that we need to work an awful lot harder to give men who are going to become fathers a vision of how to be a masculine man. Because what we're getting now is metrosexuals very confused about who they are and their sexual identity.
There's definitely a lot of uncertainty for these guys in a lot of areas, which was why I encouraged discussion during lunch or dinner time to give them the chance to hash out philosophical issues, and like you say, it often turned to these were issues that they struggled with, and sometimes they would come to me privately to talk about issues of masculinity, unprompted by me, may I add. I want to make that clear to the listeners. This was not something that I set out, this was not a recruiting situation in the way that feminists go into tertiary institutions and actively go recruiting. What I found was that by making myself available, the questions were there, but they had previously had nobody to ask.
Well, I think the other point is, I find it very difficult. Obviously, talking to Andy, we talk a lot about what's happening to men in our society. I don't think in the history of mankind has there ever been a time when women have turned on men with this much ferocity, and with many of them who are in positions of very great power, with a determination to disengage men from families and, in a sense, out of jobs and off the planet if they can do it. It's very, very frightening. And I know that people listening in might think I'm exaggerating. I promise you I'm not. And it's getting very late for everybody who's asleep to refuse to wake up and see what's happening.
How about physical sport in education?
Well, we don't have it anymore, do we? Private schools have it.
Geoffrey, what's your experience? Because I can certainly remember the rainy days in the school football field. I think certainly from the working class town I came from, physical sport was extremely important, and it's extremely important to people of my father's generation. How has it changed in your experience?
Well, look, I'll put it this way. Sport is still very important in Australian culture. So the situation is perhaps not as dire as it is in some other nations. So the guys would often, if it was a daytime class, they would often go outside and go and play. During a break, they'd go and play whatever sport. Somebody would bring a soccer ball or something like that.
Sure.
So it wasn't now, because this was a technical college. It wasn't really part of what we were doing, but the facilities were available. There was a field, and there was some other very, very basic type sporting facilities available. for students that wanted to engage in them. It wasn't really an area that I touched on. But because it's such a big part of Australian culture, a fair few guys were playing sport on the weekends outside of school, so probably not something I can comment on with any help, with any usefulness, other than to say that you're right. It has still become rarer in Australian schools, but the outside the school activities have sort of held the line, I suppose.
Erin, I know that you also work with some young boys in your experience in going into schools. Do you have
on the whole, most of the schools, state schools, have sold off their playing fields. You get a contrast between the boys who are in our public schools, which it's a fee-paying school, who have everything available to them, and the girls. If you go into the state school system, they'll certainly have a period of time when they can go outside and play football. And there's not much else offered for the girls, actually, but the boys can. But it's nothing like the amount of physical exercise boys should have before they're expected to sit in class. In the refuge school that I had, all the children had to run round the school that we had several times, round the building, before I even expected them to sit down and listen to what was coming next. And it bothers me because trapping boys and depriving them of any kind of excess energy that they need to let off means that within the classroom system, they very quickly begin to play up. And by that time they're 9 or 10, they are as tall as most women teachers who are trying to deal with them. The majority of women teachers I come across scream at them because they're trying to get themselves heard. Those women at that age, it's very hard for a boy to be respectful because apart from anything else, most of them within the home have been screamed at by their mothers, and they certainly don't want to go to school and be screamed at by teachers.
Mm. It also has a desensitizing effect as well, doesn't it? I mean, the more you scream at them, the less. I mean, I'm not saying it's a good idea in the first place, but somebody who's never screamed at is going to take it a lot more seriously if they are. Somebody who's screamed at all the time is just going to tune out.
And the other point is using, and we do this in England, I don't know about you in Australia, but shaming children. This is a weapon of control. And you hear teachers trashing the child. You're stupid. Why can't you listen? Are you deaf? And you look at her and the boy's face, and you actually realize that what's building in him is an utter impotent hatred for these women that they have to endure.
Oh. Christina Hoff Summers, in her book War on Boys, talks about the removal of competition from the education system, and the effect it has on young boys. Now, I know this is an American book, but I'm wondering what kind of connection there is between Australia. I also asked this question of a friend of mine who was one of my teachers at school, and I don't think he understood initially what I meant by competition, but he did say in the end that what's changed in the education system is that nobody's allowed to fail anymore. So there's no gradients. There's no contrast between failure and success. So in effect, there's no competition. Is that something that's prevalent in the Australian education system?
Very much so, and I'm really glad you brought it up because it's completely disappeared. Now, where I was working, they had this ridiculous policy where, because we can't let anybody feel bad, okay, we can't have that. A couple of things. I'm going to start with the stupidest one. You're not allowed to use red pen to mark people's work because that will make them feel bad. You're not allowed to put crosses on people's work. You're not allowed to put crosses if they get a wrong answer. You put a dash with a note next to it. Because they might, if they see the cross, it might damage their self-esteem, and I wish I was making this up.
I know you're not, though. I know you're not. And the trouble is, girls, actually, competition in girls, certainly it does happen, but for boys, with all that testosterone, it gives an edge to what they're doing. And if they're not allowed to compete, they won't bother, because their strength doesn't go up.
Well, see, here's the second thing. The way that we were marking when I first started was the usual sort of, you give out scores, here's your percentage score, and we'll grade you based on that. But the way that changed was they said, oh, well, once again, that's not important. What we really need to know is whether they are competent or not competent. And you're not allowed to call it a pass or a fail. So what you have to do is you give them a mark, and all we want to know is whether they are competent or not competent, and that's the end of the story. So no, somebody there might have barely passed and somebody there might be a genius, but it doesn't matter. You're both classified as competent. Doesn't that make you feel good?
Well, no, because what it does to the boys at the end of the day is to make them into sort of pastry cases, because they've just lost all interest. I think it's terribly sad. This goes back to my early experiences when my son was little. And we were all supposed to, as good feminists, which everybody, of course, assumed you were and I wasn't, had to make sure that our sons were actually emasculated. They couldn't have guns, they couldn't have Tonka toys, what they should be having is playing with their sisters' toys, because the idea was that masculinity was a social construct. Get rid of it, and then you're going to have this wonderful world where boys are exactly the same as girls, and they're going to grow up, and everything will be feminized. Do you know what? It's happened.
That's terrible, and I can really appreciate the damage that could do to a male mind. I think that's a disgusting way to treat half the human population.
Well, this is why I say that the changes have happened so quickly in Australia, because when I was at school, to sound like an old fart to anybody who's listening, when I was at school, the school had a rifle club. We had a rifle club, and you could go down there and you could shoot live ammo.
Excellent.
That was part of school culture. It was they would put the flag up, the red flag, indicating that the rifle range was in use with live ammunition, and you would go there and you could do target practice.
Excellent. Yeah, and the same should be true for girls. But now there's absolutely no question of it.
How has some other things changed, Geoffrey? We've already spoken about sports and the rifle club. What about technology and hands-on activities?
This is a big one for me. We're having worked in the tech industry, and the subjects I was teaching were tech subjects. The situation with technology in schools is completely topsy-turvy. They've got everything backwards. What they've done is they've said, oh, technology is such a boon to students, and so they've given year ones calculators before they can even count properly. And then they have year threes using word processors that do all their spell checking for them and do all the layout for them, instead of that physical process of putting together an assignment, or putting together a poster. It used to be that the process of putting together a simple year 3 or 4 project would require multiple skills. You had to cut and paste things together. You had to go to the library and look up books and learn, or learn the form of searching for, reading and understand information. And almost everything that I saw, now that was brought in, that sort of has been going on for a while. So by the time these guys had gotten to me, what I was getting when I was handing out written assignments, I was getting back stuff that was just copy-pasted from any page that met the search criteria, whether it was relevant or not. If it had, if it was the top hit on Google, they'd just copy and paste about 3 paragraphs of text into their assignment and assume that the correct answer would be in there somewhere. And occasionally it was. But I probably, out of all the work which we did, I probably failed more assignments than any other type, or I failed more students for assignments than any other type of assessment. So they've got this situation where they've introduced technology into the primary school level for kids at a really young age. They're not learning the basic skills. Then they give them laptops when they get to secondary school, or iPads for year 5s or for other primary school students as there. And they say, oh, technology is a tool for teaching. Well, what I hear when somebody says that, and I've heard that straight from the mouth of a primary school principal that I was having a discussion with, what I hear from that is, Kids don't need to be able to add because they've got calculators. Kids don't need to be able to spell because they've got spell checkers. Kids don't need to be able to write because they've got word processors. And then they say to me, well, we don't teach computing anymore because we have Windows. Well, basically what you're saying is that kids don't need to learn the process of logic and reason and problem solving. Let's not teach those skills. Because basic computer skills, I'm talking about interacting with a computer at the command line level, teaches you, or learning to program very basic programs at the primary level, teaches you how technology works in today's world. It's that you might issue a command and you might think it's going to do something, and it doesn't actually do that because you didn't fully understand the command that you were giving. And I had students come to me in my operating systems class and say to me, we have learnt more about programming in your operating systems class than we learnt in programming class.
The other point that everybody seems to have forgotten is the brain, if it's not used because it's supplied from outside, essentially will remain extremely immature, because without the building blocks that all this kind of teaching is supposed to create within the brain, you're going to have people who, without using a computer, are going to be completely lost.
No, look, I mean, they're turned to use, they're taught to use Microsoft Word, the latest version of Microsoft Word, and then the teachers say, oh, they're computer literate. No, they're not computer literate. They've been taught just one version of one piece of software, which is going to change in 3 years anyway. The kids that I was getting through were less computer literate as time went on than they were 10 years ago.
It's almost the case that kids are being taught what to think and not how to think. I think that's lacking, that kids are not being taught how to think, how to put the building blocks together, and how to
I don't even think they've been taught what to think, to be honest. I don't even think it goes that far. I think it's that bad with technology, especially evident with technology-related stuff. They're not being even taught what to think. They're just being taught a series of actions to take. You know, like a monkey could do that. You could, press these buttons in this sequence.
Yeah.
There's no thought going on there. It's simple. It's barely even repetition.
Sorry, you go ahead, Erin.
Okay, I was just going to say, it does sound sort of doom-laden, but I am concerned, and I wonder why, since most people have a very powerful sense that we have been failing boys internationally, not just in England, why there has never been any concerted effort from any of the governments to recognize this problem and see it as probably one of the primary problems that politically they face at this time of our lives. What are we going to do with this forgotten generation of boys who we have allowed to fail through the lack of schooling or care for them? And at the moment, what's happening is most of them are filtering off to prison or junior federal establishments because we punish them. We punish them because we failed them. That's my concern.
Well, look, I mean, all I can say is from my perspective, the situation is going to get worse, but because I do have I consider myself an optimist to a degree because, as I said, they do have each other. And I'm not talking about gangs or gang violence. I mean, that still exists. But these guys who are at least in the tertiary education system are coming out with some useful skills. And I said to them, look, nobody can really give you a sense of purpose. You have to find it for yourself. And most of them seemed to sort of understand that, but didn't feel that they had an incentive to do so because the odds were, the deck was stacked against them. And I said to them, you're right, it is. So you're just going to have to make the best for it. And they seemed prepared to take on that challenge once it was articulated. But you're right that there's probably going to be that. unless the situation turns around, the number who are going to be prepared to take on that challenge are going to reduce and reduce. But at this point, there's still something there that says to them that they feel they could have something, that there may be something that they can make of themselves. As long, once they're not being fed bullshit, if you'll excuse the word, they do seem prepared to at least look at the possibility that they could make something better.
Yeah. I think we're coming to the end of this show, but I'd like to perhaps ask and ponder what does the future hold, and what could be a positive change for the future, and what could we do to help make that happen? How could things change for the better?
How could things change for the better? Well, for starters, reintroducing perhaps male guest teachers into the primary school space is something I would like to see, or guest, what's the word I'm looking for? Sorry, somebody who volunteers to come along and talk about their area of expertise for a couple of weeks. So, if there's a man who's a mechanical engineer who can come along and talk to the boys for 2 or 3 weeks, or show them something interesting, take it apart with them. It doesn't have to take a huge amount of time away from regular classes. But if it was possible to bring or to appeal to professional men who are, lawyers or mechanics or whatever skill they might have, to come along and talk to the boys at school, to give them something to be interested in from a learning perspective, that would be, that's not too much to ask, I think. It would be great to say, let's revamp the whole educational system. That'll solve the problem. Sure, but if you're talking about a first small step, that's probably something that could actually be accomplished. If the school system were, or if there was enough support for the idea of getting men in professional spaces to come in and talk for 2 or 3 weeks about the things that they do, and to give some kind of demonstration, and to be able to have question and answer, or even for the boys to get their hands on something, whatever it happens to be. And if that happened, say 2 times a term, or 8 times a year or something like that during primary school, that would at least start to turn things in the right direction, I think. It's just, it's a small first achievable step, I feel.
Erin, what's the reality of that actually happening? Who would be responsible, say, in England, for making sure that happen, and is it ever going to happen?
One of our problems is men aren't going to work in primary schools when they've been told by one of our many women ministers that men can't be trusted with children, said publicly. Men aren't about to want good relationships with women when Harriet Harman, who is very powerful, has already said that men aren't necessarily harmonious. I had a program in the refuge. The older boys were all apprenticed to a working man, mostly tradespeople, mechanics, and welders and whatever. And they worked, and those were their mentors. And they worked one-to-one, and they helped build all our squats. That works. But I doubt if anybody's going to listen to me.
Geoffrey, do you have any final words to say on that?
Both of Erin's concerns are something that I've considered, and I feel that by having them as guests or as volunteers, because I'm sure the men are. Well, I'm sure that the men are aware of the risks of working with children and accusations being made, which is why I felt that if it's on a guest 2 or 3 week only basis, then it mitigates the risk of any accusations being made, especially if it's in a sort of an assembly type area with, say, 30 or 40 kids, and you could have other people looking on where they're addressing a group of kids, then it does mitigate the risk for them somewhat.
He would still have to have a police record check, wouldn't he?
Oh yes, that goes without saying.
Well, that says it all, really. That the assumption now is, by default, all men are possible pedophiles.
Well, there is one thing I will mention, which is that where I am, there is anybody, this is men and women, who wants to work with anybody under the age of 18 have to have a check done. Now, I think, to be honest, I think it's a bit of a paranoid response to a problem that
I absolutely agree.
But at the same time, these checks are now so common that the process is relatively streamlined, so it wouldn't be considered unusual at this point. It wouldn't be considered extreme to go through that process, at least where I am.
Well, there's any question of whether it's extreme or not. You have to.
No, that's what I mean. What I mean is that there are so many people now who have had these checks done that it's not unusual.
But we're beginning to accept. Then it frightens me that what comes next. What other hurdle will a man have to get through?
No, I think most people think it's silly. Most people I've heard articulated have said, well, all it proves is that they haven't caught you yet. You know, is the most common complaint I've heard. But my point is that it's not a big scary stick which you would be waving at a volunteer because if you see what I mean.
I do.
So, I agree with you. I also think I'm not aware of any case where it's actually made a difference, despite the fact that all these checks have been done. I'm sure it would have been all over the news if somebody who had been caught causing problems with kids tried to apply for one of these checks. But I think that the idea of having them as a guest mitigates the risk to a degree. So that's probably the final thing I'll say on that.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank you, Geoffrey, for joining us today. This is a good point to wrap up the show. Your regular host, Dean Esme, will be back with us for the next show. So with that, that's goodbye from me. And goodbye from Erin. Say goodbye, Erin.
No. Yeah, goodbye, everybody.
And finally, I'd like to thank James Huff for taking care of us behind the scenes. James, can you take us out? Can you take us out, please? You have been listening to Revelations with Erin Pizzey and her co-host, Dean Esme. Our show's opening music is called Eternal Hope, and the closing piece is called Sunshine. Both pieces are by Kevin MacLeod and are used under the Creative Commons Attribution License, with a link in the show notes. We also wish to thank James Huff and Paul Elam, and indeed all those who are part of the A Voice for Men community for their support for this show. Remember, in truth there is hope and healing, and we hope that you will be part of helping to spread the truth and the healing. Please join us next time in Revelations with Erin Pizzey.